They were Japanese prisoners of war, captured in the Pacific and transported thousands of miles from everything they knew. They expected hunger, unfamiliar food, and deliberate humiliation. Instead, the first meal placed in front of them inside an American prison camp forced many to pause, stare, and quietly question whether this captivity was real. For many Japanese prisoners of war, food was inseparable from identity, discipline, and survival. Military training had emphasized endurance, simplicity, and strict hierarchy, shaping expectations about what captivity would look like. Hunger was assumed to be inevitable, and unfamiliar food was expected to be used as a tool of humiliation rather than nourishment. These assumptions followed them across the ocean when they arrived in American prison camps. The camps themselves offered no immediate reassurance. Barbed wire enclosed wide, open spaces, guard towers stood at measured distances, and routines were enforced with calm authority. Nothing suggested comfort or accommodation. Japanese POWs prepared themselves mentally for deprivation, believing that food would be scarce, poorly prepared, and intentionally alien. That expectation began to unravel at the first meal. Trays were distributed methodically, portions were measured, and the food was served hot. Bread, meat, vegetables, and rice appeared together, arranged without ceremony but with consistency. The unfamiliar was present, but it was not imposed with mockery or force. For many prisoners, the shock was not what they were given, but how it was given. Confusion replaced certainty. Some prisoners hesitated before eating, watching others closely for signs of reaction or consequence. Years of training had conditioned them to distrust generosity from an enemy. Food, in their understanding, was meant to reinforce submission, not routine. Yet the guards did not rush them, nor did they comment on what was consumed. The meal proceeded quietly, without spectacle. The persistence of this routine deepened the shock. Meals followed schedules. Portions remained stable. The same food appeared again the next day, and then the day after that. This consistency was unsettling because it suggested planning rather than improvisation. A single generous meal could be dismissed as deception. Repetition could not. For Japanese POWs, the presence of familiar staples alongside unfamiliar dishes complicated perception further. Rice, a cultural anchor, appeared regularly, but it was prepared differently, served with foods they had never associated with captivity. This blending challenged deeply held beliefs about how enemies treated prisoners and how identity was preserved under confinement. As days passed, food ceased to be a momentary surprise and became a question without a clear answer. Why maintain nutrition for captured enemies? Why provide balance rather than scarcity? The absence of explanation intensified speculation. Some prisoners believed the system was designed to weaken resolve through comfort, while others suspected it served a purpose not yet visible. What became clear, however, was that captivity in America did not begin with starvation. It began with routine. And for Japanese prisoners of war, that realization marked the first crack in everything they believed imprisonment was meant to be. For Japanese prisoners of war, the structure surrounding food inside American camps was not simply a matter of nutrition, but a direct challenge to deeply ingrained cultural expectations. In the Japanese military system, food had long been tied to discipline, hierarchy, and endurance. Scarcity was not merely tolerated. It was often interpreted as a test of character. Captivity, therefore, was expected to amplify deprivation rather than soften it. Upon arrival in the United States, Japanese POWs encountered a system that treated meals as part of administrative order rather than punishment. Food schedules were posted clearly, portions were standardized, and preparation followed predictable routines. This approach contrasted sharply with the uncertainty many prisoners had experienced during transport or on the battlefield, where meals were irregular and survival depended on improvisation. The composition of meals introduced an additional layer of complexity. Rice, a central element of Japanese diet and identity, appeared frequently, but it was accompanied by bread, meat, and vegetables prepared in unfamiliar ways. This combination felt neither fully foreign nor fully familiar, creating a sense of disorientation rather than comfort. Prisoners struggled to interpret whether this blending was intentional accommodation or simply standard American practice applied without regard for cultural meaning. The manner in which food was served mattered as much as what was served. Guards distributed trays calmly, without ridicule or commentary. Prisoners were allowed to eat at a steady pace, and conversation, though subdued, was not actively suppressed. This absence of hostility unsettled many Japanese POWs who had been conditioned to associate captivity with overt humiliation. Medical considerations played a central role in shaping these practices. American camp administrators prioritized nutritional adequacy to prevent disease, maintain labor capacity, and reduce unrest. Balanced meals supported physical stability and minimized medical intervention, which was both practical and economical. For prisoners, however, this rationale was invisible, leaving them to speculate about motives. Over time, patterns reinforced themselves. Meals arrived consistently, portions did not fluctuate in response to behavior, and no special privileges were granted based on compliance. Food existed outside the immediate economy of reward and punishment. This neutrality challenged the assumption that every aspect of captivity would be used to assert dominance. Japanese POWs responded to this system in varied ways. Some approached meals cautiously, consuming only what felt familiar and avoiding unfamiliar items. Others experimented quietly, testing whether acceptance carried consequences. As days turned into weeks, survival instincts began to outweigh suspicion, and eating became routine rather than an event charged with anxiety. The psychological impact of this routine was subtle but significant. Regular nourishment reduced physical weakness, which in turn altered emotional resilience. Prisoners found themselves less consumed by hunger and more aware of time passing. Without starvation to dominate thought, attention shifted inward, toward reflection and uncertainty. This shift was particularly difficult for those who believed suffering was an expected component of honorable defeat. Adequate food disrupted that narrative, forcing prisoners to confront the possibility that endurance might take a different form. Instead of resisting deprivation, they were adapting to structure. By the end of their first weeks, Japanese POWs understood that food in American camps was not a temporary gesture. It was a foundation of the system itself. Meals were designed to sustain, regulate, and normalize captivity, rather than to break bodies through neglect. This realization did not bring comfort. It brought confusion. For many, the first meal had been shocking. The weeks that followed were more unsettling. They revealed that imprisonment in America would not test endurance through hunger alone, but through the quiet pressure of routine, consistency, and adaptation. As daily meals settled into routine, Japanese prisoners of war began to notice that food inside American camps was not treated as an isolated privilege, but as part of a broader system that emphasized order and predictability. Mealtimes were synchronized with roll calls, work details, and medical checks, creating a rhythm that structured each day with little variation. This coordination reinforced the sense that nourishment was administrative, not emotional, and governed by regulation rather than discretion. The consistency of portions became particularly significant. Trays looked the same from day to day, and adjustments were rare. Food did not increase with compliance or decrease with resistance. This neutrality unsettled many prisoners who expected every aspect of captivity to be leveraged for control. Instead, food appeared insulated from momentary behavior, existing within a fixed framework that did not invite negotiation. Cultural differences sharpened this perception. Japanese POWs compared camp meals to the strict rationing they had experienced during the war, where shortages were common and hierarchy determined access. In American camps, hierarchy mattered far less at the table. Officers and enlisted men received similar meals, and the emphasis remained on nutritional adequacy rather than rank. This leveling effect challenged deeply held assumptions about authority and entitlement. The role of rice continued to carry symbolic weight. While rice was present, it was prepared and served according to American logistical standards rather than Japanese custom. Its inclusion suggested recognition of dietary familiarity, yet its preparation underscored the dominance of the camp system. This duality created mixed reactions as prisoners struggled to reconcile a sense of cultural continuity with the reality of imposed routine. Over time, the act of eating became less charged with suspicion and more entwined with survival pragmatism. Hunger no longer dictated every decision, and the body gradually stabilized. This physical stability altered emotional responses, reducing immediate anxiety while increasing awareness of the long-term nature of confinement. Without the constant pressure of deprivation, the future felt more distant and uncertain. Conversations during meals reflected this shift. Initial silence gave way to cautious discussion about food quality, preparation, and expectations. These discussions rarely carried gratitude. Instead, they focused on interpretation. Prisoners debated whether consistent nourishment was meant to pacify, to preserve labor capacity, or to project an image of lawful treatment. The absence of clear answers sustained unease. American guards reinforced the administrative tone through their behavior. They observed without interference, corrected procedural issues, and maintained schedules without commentary. Food was delivered and consumed under supervision, but not spectacle. This calm oversight reduced overt tension while amplifying ambiguity. Control was present, yet it did not announce itself through aggression. Medical staff played a quiet but influential role. Regular checks monitored weight, general health, and signs of deficiency. These assessments confirmed that meals were designed to sustain long-term confinement rather than temporary holding. For prisoners, this realization deepened the understanding that captivity was expected to last and that their bodies were being maintained accordingly. The economic implications also became apparent. Food required supply chains, planning, and allocation. The reliability of these systems suggested commitment rather than improvisation. Japanese POWs recognized that such investment would not be made casually, reinforcing the sense that American camps operated with long-term objectives. By the end of this phase, meals had lost their initial shock value, but their meaning continued to evolve. Food was no longer surprising in form, yet remained unsettling in function. It sustained life without offering explanation, reinforced order without visible coercion, and signaled that captivity in America would be defined by systems rather than extremes. For Japanese prisoners of war, this realization marked another step away from expectation and toward a deeper, more complex understanding of imprisonment. Nourishment, once imagined as a tool of humiliation, had become an instrument of routine. And within that routine, uncertainty quietly replaced fear as the dominant emotional response. As nourishment stabilized daily life, the psychological impact of food inside American camps became increasingly apparent for Japanese prisoners of war. Eating no longer revolved around survival alone. It began to affect identity, discipline, and the internal frameworks through which prisoners understood defeat and endurance. This shift was subtle, but its consequences were long-lasting. In Japanese military culture, hardship had been closely associated with honor. Endurance under scarcity was seen as proof of loyalty and strength, while comfort carried the risk of moral weakness. Adequate food in captivity disrupted this association. Being fed consistently, even by an enemy, challenged the belief that suffering was a necessary condition of honorable imprisonment. This contradiction produced internal conflict. Some prisoners experienced shame, interpreting nourishment as an erosion of resolve. Others viewed it as a practical necessity that did not diminish loyalty. These competing interpretations created quiet divisions within the camps, as men adapted at different rates to the same conditions. The routine of meals reinforced these tensions. Eating at set times, receiving predictable portions, and consuming food without humiliation made daily life feel structured rather than adversarial. This structure reduced immediate stress, but it also removed a clear focal point for resistance. Without hunger to sharpen anger, emotions became more complex and harder to direct. Food also influenced how prisoners perceived time. Regular meals divided the day into manageable segments, anchoring experience in routine rather than uncertainty. This temporal stability made confinement feel longer and more deliberate. Days passed without dramatic change, extending captivity into a prolonged psychological state that required patience rather than endurance through crisis. For some Japanese POWs, the presence of familiar elements, such as rice, intensified this effect. Familiarity reduced alienation, making adaptation easier while simultaneously deepening discomfort. The enemy had not erased cultural identity entirely, but neither had they embraced it fully. This partial recognition blurred boundaries and complicated emotional responses. Interactions among prisoners reflected these shifts. Conversations moved from suspicion toward analysis, as men debated the meaning behind consistent nourishment. Some argued that food was used to weaken resistance by promoting comfort, while others believed it was intended to preserve prisoners for labor or repatriation. These discussions rarely reached consensus, reinforcing uncertainty rather than clarity. The role of self-control also evolved. Prisoners who once restricted themselves out of principle began to eat more freely as weeks passed. Hunger asserted itself against ideology, and the body's needs gradually reshaped behavior. This adaptation did not eliminate internal conflict, but it demonstrated the power of routine to override belief over time. American camp administration benefited from this transformation without direct intervention. Stable, nourished prisoners were calmer, healthier, and easier to manage. Food reduced volatility and supported the broader system of control that relied on order rather than force. For prisoners, recognizing this function added another layer of unease. Nourishment felt less like kindness and more like infrastructure. As emotional responses shifted from fear to ambiguity, prisoners found themselves questioning not only their captors, but their own assumptions. If captivity did not conform to expectations of degradation, then the narratives they had accepted required reevaluation. This realization was not liberating. It was disorienting. By this stage, food had become inseparable from the psychological experience of captivity. It sustained the body while quietly reshaping perception, reducing suffering without offering relief. For Japanese prisoners of war, this subtle transformation marked one of the most challenging aspects of imprisonment in America because it tested endurance not through deprivation, but through adaptation to an unfamiliar and deeply unsettling normalcy. As food routines continued without interruption, Japanese prisoners of war began to recognize how closely nourishment was connected to observation and regulation inside American camps. Meals were not only about sustaining the body, but about integrating prisoners into a wider system that monitored health, behavior, and compliance with remarkable precision. This realization deepened the sense that captivity was governed by administration rather than improvisation. Medical oversight played a central role in this system. Camp doctors and orderlies conducted regular examinations, tracking weight, general condition, and signs of malnutrition. These checks were routine and impersonal, carried out according to schedules rather than reactions to individual behavior. For prisoners, the experience of being measured and recorded reinforced the understanding that their physical condition mattered to the system holding them. Food distribution reflected the same logic. Quantities were calculated to meet nutritional requirements rather than emotional expectations. Adjustments were made based on labor demands and health indicators, not on discipline or morale. This separation of nourishment from punishment unsettled many prisoners who had expected deprivation to be used as leverage. Instead, food remained stable even when tensions rose elsewhere in camp life. The relationship between nourishment and work became increasingly clear. Prisoners assigned to physically demanding tasks were monitored closely to ensure they maintained strength. Meals supported labor capacity, reinforcing the idea that prisoners were resources to be managed rather than bodies to be broken. This pragmatic approach challenged assumptions about the goals of imprisonment. Observation extended into the mess halls themselves. Guards positioned themselves to oversee movement and order, but rarely intervened unless procedures were disrupted. Eating was supervised but not rushed, and conversation was tolerated within limits. This calm oversight created an environment where control was present but understated, relying on routine rather than intimidation. For Japanese POWs, this form of control proved difficult to interpret. The absence of overt hostility denied them a clear adversary. Instead of cruelty, they encountered consistency. Instead of chaos, they faced regulation. This approach reduced immediate fear while increasing long-term uncertainty, as prisoners struggled to understand how to resist a system that did not visibly attack them. Cultural perspectives intensified this confusion. In their own military experience, strict discipline often manifested through hardship and scarcity. In American camps, discipline manifested through order and predictability. Food became one of the most visible expressions of this difference, highlighting contrasting philosophies of control. As awareness grew, prisoners began to view meals as signals rather than events. Each tray represented continuity. Each schedule reinforced expectation. Nourishment confirmed that captivity was intended to last, and that bodies were being preserved accordingly. This realization shifted emotional focus away from immediate survival toward enduring confinement. Some prisoners interpreted this preservation as preparation for future use, whether for labor, exchange, or repatriation. Others saw it as an attempt to project legitimacy under international scrutiny. Regardless of interpretation, the effect remained the same. Food maintained stability while withholding explanation. By this stage, nourishment had become inseparable from the camp's administrative identity. It supported health, reinforced order, and sustained a controlled environment that minimized volatility. For Japanese prisoners of war, recognizing this function marked a critical moment. Captivity in America was not designed to exhaust through hunger. It was designed to endure through management. This understanding added weight to daily life. Meals no longer surprised, but they continued to unsettle. Each consistent serving reinforced the realization that imprisonment was governed by systems that operated quietly and efficiently. For prisoners accustomed to equating power with force, this silent control proved one of the most challenging aspects of their confinement. By the later stages of captivity, food had lost its initial power to shock Japanese prisoners of war, but had gained a deeper and more unsettling influence over their daily existence. What once triggered suspicion and disbelief had become routine, and with that routine came a profound shift in how prisoners experience time, discipline, and adaptation under confinement. Regular meals structured the day in predictable ways. Breakfast marked the beginning of controlled movement. Lunch divided work from rest, and dinner signaled the return to barracks and limited quiet. This rhythm reduced physical stress and stabilized the body, but it also stretched captivity into something steady and prolonged. Without hunger to create urgency, days blended together, and confinement felt less chaotic but more enduring. This endurance created a new psychological challenge. Prisoners were no longer reacting to immediate deprivation, but adjusting to a system designed for long-term containment. Adequate nourishment preserved strength, which in turn prolonged awareness of captivity itself. The body remained capable, alert, and present, leaving the mind with fewer distractions from the reality of confinement. Food also shaped social dynamics within the camps. As meals became predictable, conversations shifted away from fear and speculation toward reflection. Prisoners discussed the war's progress, the possibility of return, and the meaning of defeat. Nourishment made such reflection possible by removing constant physical distress, but it also intensified emotional tension by allowing thoughts to linger. For some Japanese POWs, adaptation to routine felt like surrender of principle. They struggled with the idea that survival no longer required resistance to deprivation, but acceptance of structure. Others viewed adaptation as unavoidable, separating physical maintenance from moral conviction. These differing responses created quiet divisions, shaping how individuals related to one another and to the camp environment. American administrators continued to rely on nourishment as a stabilizing element. Consistent meals reduced illness, lowered disciplinary incidents, and supported the broader framework of control. From an administrative perspective, food was not an emotional gesture, but an essential component of an orderly system. Its success lay in its predictability rather than generosity. As the war progressed, news filtering into the camps altered how prisoners interpreted their circumstances. Defeats and advances elsewhere did not affect meal schedules or portions. This separation reinforced the sense that captivity operated independently of battlefield outcomes. Food remained constant even as the world beyond the fences shifted dramatically. Toward the end of their imprisonment, many Japanese POWs began to recognize that nourishment had reshaped their understanding of captivity itself. It had removed suffering as the central test and replaced it with endurance through routine. This realization was not comforting. It forced prisoners to confront the power of systems that controlled without overt cruelty. In retrospect, food became one of the most revealing aspects of captivity in America. It demonstrated that control could be exercised quietly through consistency and administration rather than through deprivation. For Japanese prisoners of war, this lesson lingered long after release. They remembered not only what they ate, but what it represented, a form of captivity that sustained the body while steadily testing the mind through adaptation rather than hunger. For Japanese prisoners of war held in the United States, food became one of the most unexpected and psychologically complex elements of captivity. It was not the taste or quantity that left the deepest mark, but the consistency and intent behind it. Nourishment followed schedules, met nutritional standards, and remained unchanged regardless of behavior or circumstance, signaling a system built on regulation rather than emotion. This approach reshaped how captivity was experienced. By removing starvation from the equation, American camps replaced fear with administration. Meals arrived on time, portions remained stable, and the body was maintained even as freedom remained firmly denied. The absence of deprivation denied prisoners a familiar framework through which to interpret suffering, forcing them instead to adapt to routine. For many Japanese POWs, this contradiction proved deeply unsettling. Adequate food preserved strength and identity, yet it also prolonged awareness of confinement. Clean, nourished bodies endured captivity not through crisis, but through time. This endurance challenged long-held beliefs about honor, suffering, and the nature of defeat. Food also revealed a broader philosophy of control. Rather than breaking prisoners through neglect, the system sought to contain them through predictability. Nourishment supported health, reduced unrest, and sustained an environment that could function indefinitely. In this way, food became infrastructure rather than gesture, reinforcing order without visible cruelty. When the war ended and prisoners returned home, memories of meals often stood alongside memories of labor and routine. They remembered being fed consistently by an enemy they had been taught to fear, and how that consistency disrupted expectations more powerfully than hardship might have. In the end, food in American captivity was not an act of kindness, nor was it a simple necessity. It was a quiet instrument of control, maintaining bodies while testing minds. For those who lived through it, this realization lingered long after the fences disappeared, reshaping how they understood power, imprisonment, and the subtle forces that define endurance in war. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.